I want to take a moment to tell you about my day-to-day. I was dispatched on my first run this morning at 7:30 a.m. The run that I was dispatched on at 7:30 a.m. was a call for service that originated at 7:45 the night before. So the very first person that I went to speak to today was someone that called 911 and had to wait almost 12 hours to speak to an officer. There's a variety of reasons for why this happened. One of the reasons is that there's not enough officers to go around. And the officers that are working they're overworked and understaffed. One of the biggest reasons for this is the political environment in the city that I work in. The politicians in the ruling class have created an environment that's so hostile to police officers that police officers are leaving at record rates. On top of that, the powers that be thought it would be a good idea to offer the top 100 most senior officers on the department a financial incentive to leave early. They thought that by doing so, they could change the culture of the department because they believed that the department I work for had a negative culture and that we were not good guys as a whole. So now there's officers on the street forced to do the same amount of work, if not more, because violent crime has been on the rise over the last 2 years. So the officers on the street are actually doing more with fewer resources and less officers to respond to these kind of calls. This created a situation last night on the precinct where I work that caused a person to wait 12 hours for a police officer to respond and talk to her. The cascade of events that led to this were the day before or yesterday, there was an officer on second shift who was responding to a run and he was injured. That injury situation required a lot of officers to respond. They had to respond to his aid. They had to respond to take care of his equipment, take care of his cruiser, go to the hospital with him, take care of the scene at the house where he was injured. While they were dealing with that, a call of shots fired rang out, and the officers had to respond to an incident where somebody had been shot. That requires a lot of officers. Officers have to canvass for evidence. Officers have to protect the victim, take the victim to the hospital or travel to the hospital with the victim. They have to gather up any witnesses, cordon off the area, make sure people don't go in and out of the scene, and hold the scene for detectives and evidence technicians to respond and process the scene. That basically tied up every officer for the rest of the shift. The officers were tied up and not responding to calls, but the calls did not stop coming in. So when third shift officers arrived, they replaced as many of the second shift officers as they could, but some of them had to remain on overtime. One of the first calls of the night that the third shift officers took was a fight at a bar involving people with guns. The officers responded, made multiple arrests, and multiple officers were tied up almost for the remainder of the shift due to all of the paperwork and everything that's required for an officer to make an arrest in that situation. That left about 2 officers to cover this same precinct that all this activity has happened. While those officers were responding run to run to run to try to get to as many people and answer as many calls for service as they could, another call came in of shots fired. This time it was shots into a house. A man called in and said that he believed his wife was dead, that she had been shot in their bed. The bullets did not come from inside the house, they came from outside the house. When officers responded, they found 2 more people in a vehicle who had also been shot in the same incident. So now they're dealing with a very large scene. They had a vehicle that had been shot with people inside. They had a house that had been shot. They had a woman who would be deceased shortly, as well as multiple witnesses. While the officers were on scene of that homicide with multiple people shot, another call of shots fired rang out just a few blocks away on the same precinct. There was only one officer available to respond. That officer responded to a call of shots fired, and he quickly found himself in the middle of the street standing over a man who would shortly thereafter be deceased. There was one officer who responded to a homicide. That officer started airing for backup, and there was no backup. There was nobody available to go to a homicide scene with an officer. The dispatchers had to pull cars from all over the city just to cover the basics. The officers on the department are understaffed and overworked. This is going to be exacerbated by the fact that another 100 officers are going to be leaving in a very short period of time, and very few officers are applying for the job. With fewer applicants, this means that people who would generally not have made it through the hiring process are going to be forced through the hiring process. There will be no choice but to scrape the bottom of the barrel to get boots on the ground officers on the street. Those officers, we're going to have a very young department. We're going to have a very young department with a lot of officers on the street with very little experience. We have an experience vacuum, especially on some shifts. The guys with a lot of seniority don't stay on second and third shift. So you're going to have a lot of shifts with very young officers that don't have a lot of time on the street. And some of them are officers who previously would probably not have been hired by this department. If the trend of officers leaving early continues, the department is going to be so short-staffed that these new officers with very little experience are going to be required to work very long hours. It's not going to be uncommon to have officers working 6 days a week with multiple 16-hour shifts. When these new officers with very little experience are working on very little sleep, they're going to be more likely to make mistakes. And when there's mistakes made in police work, unfortunately, that often involves people getting very seriously hurt. This all began with politicians who thought that it was their job to reimagine public safety and recreate the division to be something that they wanted, because they thought that what we had before was bad. It's clear that they did not think through what it was that they were doing. And unfortunately, the people that are paying the price for these poor decisions are not going to be the politicians. It's going to be the citizens who need help from the police, and there's no police to respond. Or God forbid, it's going to be that citizen who's going to get seriously hurt by a police officer with very little experience and very little sleep because he's being overworked. People have been calling for change. Unfortunately, they're just changing things for the sake of change. And they're soon going to find out that this was not the change they were looking for. It's going to take a very long time to recover from these poor decisions. That's all I have for today.